The military-led nations of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have announced their withdrawal from the International Criminal Court, calling it nothing more than a tool of modern colonialism. For years, Africa was expected to sit silently while European judges in black robes decided who among us was guilty and who was not. But Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have now shattered that illusion. With one declaration, they burned away the ICC's image of credibility and revealed it for what it has always been: a colonial courtroom dressed up as justice. For 2 decades, the ICC claimed to represent universal law. Yet in practice, it hunted only one target: Africa. George Bush was untouchable, Tony Blair untouchable, Emmanuel Macron untouchable. But African leaders? They became trophies for The Hague. Today, the Sahel has declared enough. This is not just a withdrawal. It is an act of rebellion. For the first time in years, African governments are telling the West, your laws are not our chains. Your court is not our master. And we do not need your approval. The question that now hangs in the air is clear. What will this mean for Africa? The world woke to headlines it did not expect, though perhaps it should have. In the early hours of September 23, 2025, the military governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger released a joint statement that cut through the usual diplomatic language like a blade. They announced their immediate withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. The statement was delivered with military precision, stern, absolute, and without the soft qualifiers that usually accompany such decisions. There was no talk of review, no committees, no waiting period. It was a clean and sudden break. A court that once called itself the arbiter of international justice was, in their words, exposed as nothing more than an instrument of neo-colonial repression. With one coordinated act, the 3 governments placed themselves beyond the reach of an institution that had long hovered like a shadow over their leaders, their soldiers, and even their sovereignty. The symbolic weight of this step cannot be overstated. This is not some minor technical exit from a trade body. It is 3 African states, acting together, telling Europe and the West, your courtroom is not our destiny. What makes the move even more dramatic is its context. These are not peaceful democracies celebrating the end of conflict. These are nations in the middle of insurgency, war, and transition. Each one is ruled by a military junta that came to power in coups between 2020 and 2023. Each one is fighting brutal wars against militants who have turned the Sahel into the deadliest conflict zone on Earth. And yet, instead of bending to international scrutiny in exchange for legitimacy, they have rejected it outright. The audacity of the decision has shaken diplomatic circles from Brussels to Washington. Reactions have been immediate and nervous. The reason for the panic is clear. This is not simply a legal withdrawal. It is a crack in the facade of global institutions that still claim to be universal while practicing selective enforcement. If 3 countries can walk away today, what is to stop 5 more tomorrow? What if the African Union, already skeptical of the ICC, decides to support a broader exit? The ICC's fragile claim to African legitimacy could collapse completely. The breaking news is not only that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are leaving. The real story is that they have turned the ICC itself into the accused. They have put the court on trial in the court of global opinion, exposing its hypocrisy to ordinary Africans who already doubted it. And that accusation cannot be brushed aside, no matter how many statements are issued from The Hague. But this raises the deeper question: why does this charge cut so deeply? Why does it resonate not just in the Sahel, but across the entire continent? To answer that, we must look back at the ICC's long history in Africa, a history that explains why this withdrawal feels less like an anomaly and more like an inevitable breaking point. If the Sahel's decision seems like the bursting of a dam, it is because the water has been rising for decades. The ICC did not lose Africa overnight. It chipped away at its own credibility, case by case, omission by omission, until this rupture was unavoidable. To understand today's rebellion, we must revisit the court's record on the continent. Every indictment, every selective prosecution, every silence became a wound. Over time, those wounds bled into revolt. When the ICC was created in 2002, African countries were among its strongest supporters. There was hope, real hope, that the court would finally end the era of impunity that shielded dictators and warlords. Leaders in Kampala, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa signed on believing justice would no longer be the privilege of the powerful, but a universal standard. That hope crumbled quickly. The very first full investigations launched by the ICC were in Africa. Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic became its first testing grounds. Soon after, Sudan's Omar al-Bashir became the first sitting head of state indicted by the court. Then came Kenya, Ivory Coast, Libya. The list grew, and the ICC's map of action began to resemble a map of Africa itself. Of the first 30 individuals indicted by the ICC, almost all were African. This was not an accident. It was structural. Powerful nations such as the United States, Russia, and China never ratified the Rome Statute. They kept themselves outside the ICC's jurisdiction, all while encouraging African states to sign. The result was an uneven playing field. African governments opened their doors wide, and the ICC walked in freely, while Washington, Moscow, and Beijing kept theirs firmly closed. That imbalance meant George W. Bush could order the invasion of Iraq without consequence, while Sudanese generals found themselves facing international warrants. The African Union noticed. By the mid-2000s, frustration with the ICC was bubbling. At continental summits, leaders accused the court of targeting Africans. They highlighted the glaring double standards. Tony Blair was never summoned for the disaster of Iraq. Nicolas Sarkozy never faced charges for his role in regime change in Libya. Not a single Western general was ever prosecuted for civilian deaths in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, African presidents spent years trapped in legal limbo, their reputations destroyed by cases that sometimes collapsed without a single conviction. What made the resentment deeper was not only who was prosecuted, but who was not. Colonial crimes were left untouched. France's brutal hand in Rwanda, Belgium's atrocities in Congo, Britain's abuses in Kenya. None of these ever appeared on The Hague's docket. By excluding historical injustices, the ICC seemed less like an instrument of justice and more like a weapon of amnesia, erasing Europe's crimes while magnifying Africa's. Over time, that perception hardened into political reality. In 2016, Burundi became the first nation to formally withdraw from the ICC, citing bias. South Africa briefly announced its own departure before backtracking. Kenya openly defied the court when its leaders were indicted. The writing was already on the wall. The ICC's credibility in Africa was hanging by a thread. That thread finally snapped when the Sahel states decided they had nothing left to lose. Selective prosecutions had already alienated them. Silence on Western interventions in Libya had already enraged them. And now, as insurgencies consumed their territories, the looming threat of investigations into their own armies was the last straw. The ICC had forfeited the moral authority it once claimed. So when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger walked away, they weren't breaking from history. They were fulfilling it. They were carrying to its conclusion a decades-long African critique of an institution that never delivered on its promises. But this leaves a critical question. If the ICC has failed Africa so thoroughly, what comes next? Justice cannot simply vanish. Someone must address war crimes, atrocities, and the wounds of conflict. And that leads directly to the heart of the issue in the middle of the Sahel's wars. What does sovereignty really mean? And why did these states risk everything to take justice into their own hands? To understand why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger tore up their ICC membership, you must leave the marble halls of The Hague and step into the dust and blood of the Sahel. This is not Europe, where justice is debated in quiet seminar rooms. This is a region where villages burn in the night, children disappear into armed groups, and entire provinces fall out of state control. Here, sovereignty is not an abstract principle. It is a matter of survival. The collapse began more than a decade ago when NATO's war in Libya cracked open Muammar Gaddafi's arsenal and flooded the Sahel with weapons. Militants, traffickers, and mercenaries poured southward, embedding themselves in Mali's deserts and along Niger's borders. What began as small rebellions grew into sprawling insurgencies. Today, the Sahel is regarded as the deadliest conflict zone in the world, with death tolls surpassing even those of the Middle East. For ordinary people, war has become daily life. In central Mali, farmers are afraid to plant crops because insurgents mine their fields. In Burkina Faso, whole towns have been emptied, their people driven into makeshift camps. In Niger, border regions have become battlegrounds where state authority evaporates at nightfall. Civilians live trapped between the brutality of insurgents and the harsh crackdowns of overstretched armies. It was within this crucible that old governments fell. Elected leaders, reliant on foreign troops and international donors, could not control the chaos. Soldiers who had buried comrades after ambushes, who saw their families displaced, who fought without proper equipment, turned their anger not only against insurgents but also against their own governments. The juntas now in power are not accidents. They are children of war. And this is where sovereignty becomes non-negotiable for the military leadership. Every foreign demand, every condition tied to aid, every outside investigation is seen by these governments as a direct threat to survival. They are fighting wars they did not create. They point to NATO's destruction of Libya as the domino that triggered their current nightmare. Western powers set the fire, and now they want to dictate how Africans should put it out. This is why the ICC, with its talk of investigating alleged abuses by state forces, became intolerable. In the Sahel, soldiers are not distant figures. They are brothers, cousins, and sons of the very communities under attack. To accuse them in The Hague is to criminalize the act of defending one's homeland. The message from Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey is clear. African armies will not be judged by outsiders for fighting wars sparked by outsiders. But sovereignty here is more than defensive. It is transformative. By rejecting institutions like the ICC, the juntas are signaling they want to rewrite the rules of engagement altogether. They no longer trust imported systems of governance, justice, or security. Instead, they are forging alliances that reflect their own priorities. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, created in 2023, is not merely a military pact. It is a statement that regional self-reliance is the only way forward. French troops have been expelled. Western military bases are shrinking. Russian advisors are now welcomed. The struggle for the Sahel is being redefined as an African-led battle, free from outside dictates. And yet this creates a serious dilemma. If sovereignty is asserted so strongly, how will justice for atrocities be delivered? When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger vowed to create indigenous systems for peace and justice, it was not just a rhetorical gesture. Their declaration was radical. Accountability must be rooted in African soil, not flown in from Europe. The central question across the Sahel became, if not the ICC, then what? The answer, increasingly, is justice built by Africans for Africans. This is not unprecedented. Long before modern states or international tribunals, African societies had developed intricate systems to resolve disputes, punish wrongdoing, and restore social harmony. Justice was never about sending an offender thousands of miles away into isolation. It was about repairing the fabric of a community torn apart by violence. Consider Rwanda's Gacaca courts after the 1994 genocide. Over 1 million cases were heard in community-led forums where perpetrators and survivors faced each other directly. It was far from perfect, and critics noted flaws, but it accomplished something The Hague never could: speed, inclusivity, and a genuine attempt at reconciliation. In Ghana, traditional chiefs and councils of elders still mediate land disputes and family conflicts, relying on dialogue rather than endless litigation. In West Africa's Islamic traditions, Sharia courts have long provided localized systems of accountability where secular state justice was absent. The Sahel juntas are now drawing from this heritage with a modern twist. They are not proposing to abandon courts or laws entirely. Rather, they aim to weave together customary practices, community authority, and national institutions into something distinctly African. For example, truth-telling commissions could document atrocities in local languages, led not by foreign lawyers, but by respected community leaders. Hybrid courts might combine professional judges with elders or religious figures, ensuring rulings carry both legal weight and cultural legitimacy. Reparations could go beyond financial payouts, focusing on rebuilding destroyed villages, restoring farmland, or reintegrating former fighters through community service. Such models also respond to a long-standing frustration: distance. For many Africans, the ICC in The Hague feels remote and abstract, disconnected from daily reality. Victims rarely witness proceedings. Communities rarely experience closure. By contrast, indigenous systems bring justice directly to the people. Hearings could be held in town squares, testimony recorded in local languages, and communities present to see accountability unfold before their eyes. But the promise of indigenous justice is about more than process. It is about sovereignty itself. For too long, Africa's narrative of justice was written elsewhere. Colonial powers imposed courts that criminalized African resistance while excusing European violence. Post-colonial leaders often relied on external donors to design reforms. Now the Sahel states are saying, "We will not outsource our conscience." Justice will not be dictated by NGOs in New York or judges in The Hague. It will be shaped in the soil of Mopti and Kaya, places where blood has been spilled and where healing is most urgently needed. The challenges are immense, and the road is uncertain. But one fact is undeniable. The withdrawal from the ICC was not a leap into emptiness. It was a leap into possibility. By reviving African traditions of justice, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are sketching the outlines of an alternative model, one that rejects the assumption that Europe alone is the custodian of law and morality. They are reclaiming the right to judge themselves, to face their own wounds in their own way. And this brings us to the wider battlefield, not the deserts of the Sahel, but the global stage. Because if Africa can prove it is capable of delivering credible justice on its own terms, it will not only undermine the ICC, but also redefine the continent's place in the international order. This raises the final question. How will this bold defiance reshape Africa's geopolitical standing, and what does it mean for its ties with the West? The answer extends far beyond Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. This is not just about the Sahel. It is about Africa's future role in the global system. With one declaration, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger transform themselves from defendants into challengers, forcing the world to confront a question it has long avoided. What happens when Africa stops playing by rules it never wrote? The first tremor is political. For years, global institutions like the ICC, IMF, and World Bank operated as tools of Western influence. The unspoken message was simple: compliance brought rewards, defiance brought punishment. But by stepping away from the ICC, the Sahel trio demonstrated that these levers no longer guarantee control. If three of the world's poorest nations can reject The Hague without collapsing, what stops larger players like South Africa, Nigeria, or Ethiopia from considering the same? The precedent is dangerous for the West. The second tremor is regional. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, is no longer just a military coalition. It has become a symbol of African defiance. Expelling French troops, rejecting donor dependency, and now walking out of the ICC, the AES is carving a blueprint of what sovereignty looks like in action. Other regions are watching closely. In East Africa, where suspicion toward the ICC already runs deep, leaders may feel emboldened to assert their autonomy. In North Africa, where colonial scars remain vivid, this move could reignite debates about Europe's lingering influence. What began as a revolt in the Sahel could trigger a continental realignment. The third tremor is global. Africa's turn away from Western institutions is happening alongside a pivot toward alternative partners: Russia, China, Turkey, and even inter-African alliances. The withdrawal from the ICC fits neatly into this trend. By rejecting a court seen as European, the Sahel states are placing themselves within a multipolar order where power is contested rather than monopolized. The West fears this because legal legitimacy has always been its last weapon. Military bases can be shut down, companies can be replaced, but as long as courts in The Hague could summon African leaders, the illusion of control remained. That illusion is now breaking. But this decision is not only about defiance, it is also about imagination. If Africa is truly leaving behind external models, it must create its own. The idea of an African court of sovereign justice is no longer a fantasy. It could be developed under the African Union, with judges from across the continent, blending modern legal standards with African traditions of reconciliation. Such a body would not only serve Africans, but also show the world that justice does not need to come from Europe to be legitimate. The West will resist this shift. Expect narratives about impunity, about juntas shielding themselves, about victims left without justice. But those arguments fall flat when the very same West shields its own leaders from accountability. Washington never ratified the Rome Statute. London brushes aside Iraq. Paris avoids scrutiny for its campaigns in the Sahel. Why should Africans accept a system that spares the powerful but cages the weak? By leaving the ICC, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have not abandoned justice. They have reclaimed it. They are declaring that African blood will not be valued differently from Western blood. They are demanding that the same moral standards apply to Paris and Washington as to Bamako and Ouagadougou. And by doing so, they are reshaping the very conversation about sovereignty. The stakes are enormous. If Africa succeeds in creating its own mechanisms of accountability, it will no longer be the object of history, but the author of it. If it fails, the West will point to the collapse as proof that Africans cannot govern themselves without outside supervision. For now, however, the symbolism is undeniable. Africa has set fire to the old script and dared to write a new one. If the ICC never held Western leaders accountable, why should Africans continue to trust it? Do you think Africa can build a justice system stronger than The Hague? Let us know in the comments. Is this the moment Africa finally breaks free from neo-colonial chains?